Good day to everyone, dear ladies and gentlemen. Happy to see our distinguished presenters and participants on that venue. Nothing can separate us, and even in that challenging time. Moreover, in a new virtual format, I see that this year even more people are participating at the LiK conference, which is good. Today I am moderating the session 2.4, which is a session on distributional effects of macroeconomic policies and shocks. The issue of poverty and inequality is becoming critical, especially now after the COVID outbreak. As well as the World Bank announced, the COVID-19 adds as many as 150 million extreme poor by 2021. It's a huge number. And even in this year, in 2020, their number is expected to rise for the first time for the last 20 years. So it's a huge number and it's unfortunate tendency. Hopefully it will be changed in 2021 and afterwards. Developing countries in general are running a number of policies in different fields and in different ways that affect distribution of welfare within economies. And it is rightly mentioned in some of the presentation that most of analytics and papers and research is focused more on generalized analysis and had the macro focus, right? So it doesn't really dig into the issue of household and how they are affected by different shocks and different policies. In that way, today's session is interesting because it will be more like a household level, and I will be happy to listen to our presenters. So if we go to return to our organizational issues, you know that each presenter will have 20 minutes for the presentation and 10 minutes for Q&A session. So if you don't mind, I will interrupt you when you have like 5 minutes till the end of your time. And we have, as I mentioned, we have 3 nice works to discuss at this session. And we will start with the work of Ms. Nurgul Tilenbaeva, which is named Trade and Poverty, Evidence from the Kyrgyz Household. Nurgul Tilenbaeva is a part-time instructor at the economics department at the American University Central Asia in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. She's also a PhD candidate for development economics at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva in Switzerland. Her research interests include development economics, behavioral economics, international migration, international trade, and child health. Sounds really interesting, and I give the floor to Nurgul Tilenbaeva, please.
Good evening, everyone. Let me start sharing my screen immediately. I'm very pleased to be presenting today the results of my work. The research is entitled Trade and Poverty, Evidence from Kyrgyz Households. Here is the brief outline of the presentation. So what was the motivation behind this research? Basically, it is generally accepted in the literature that trade is beneficial for the overall growth of countries' economies. And we have some prominent examples, for example, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, among others. However, there is no consensus at this point as to the effect of trade at the individual level and as to who the potential winners and losers are, because scholars worry that even though trade is beneficial for the overall growth of countries' economies, some people may be left behind by increased trade integration, for example. So the objective of the present research is to study the effect of trade on poverty in Kyrgyzstan at the household level, and the identification strategy that I use is the standard Rajan-Zingales one. So here I focus on farm households, and I focus on the production and consumption channels of the effect of trade on poverty. So what is the contribution to literature? First of all, one of the limitations in the existing literature is that most studies look at the reduced form, so they don't really explain what are the specific channels behind the effect of trade on poverty. In my work, I study the production and consumption channels of the effect of trade on poverty. Another limitation in the literature is that most of the work is based on cross-country regressions, but I do feel that it's not always accurate to do that because it has a big assumption that the same parameter set applies to countries like Angola and England, for example, which may not make a lot of sense. So here I use a micro approach instead and focus on a single country. And in general, if we talk about scholarly literature on trade and poverty, especially the Western literature, Central Asia and Kyrgyzstan in particular have been largely overlooked. So here I focus on Kyrgyzstan. And when I do that, I use Life in Kyrgyzstan data together with UN Comtrade database and Google Maps. Just some brief review of the literature. There are different channels. I mean, the relationship between trade and poverty is very complex. So it encompasses numerous sectors of the economy, a variety of channels, a variety of actors, etc. So here I list some of the channels and markets that trade can affect individuals. So one is the market of goods and services through production and consumption channels. Another is through the labor market, through employment and wages. There could also be an effect of trade through public sector, particularly tax revenues and public spending. And then we can also talk about the effect as trade promoting the growth of the economy and after, like as a second step, growth reducing the poverty. Now, because in this work, I concentrate only on the production and consumption channels, I would like to speak a bit more about that. Here, the unit of the analysis is the farm household, and poverty is defined over this farm household. So in this theoretical framework, the farm household is viewed both as a producer of goods and as a consumer of goods. So with increased trade integration, we have an increase in the foreign demand for the commodities produced by the country. It is expected that because of this rise in demand from outside, price of the goods produced should go up because of the law of demand. As producers of these commodities, these farm households may be better off because their income rises, right? So their well-being goes up. However, as consumers of the same commodities, their well-being can go down because their consumption capacity goes down in response to the rise in prices. So we cannot tell for sure in general, if we go to the theory, if trade will have a positive or a negative effect on the farm household. And the overall effect depends on whether it's a net producer or a net consumer of the goods. Now, this discussion rests on some important assumptions. The first assumption is that following trade liberalization, countries are able to adjust their output they produce immediately in response to increased foreign demand. However, it may not be possible. It may take time. Production capacity may not be high enough. So even if the country, meaning the households who are engaged in trade, if they want to meet the increased demand, sometimes they cannot. And here the issues are access to credits, inputs, markets, and infrastructure. It means that, for example, especially the poorest farm households, they may not afford to be entrepreneurial sometimes. The second assumption is that prices following, again, the trade liberalization sometimes may not transmit quickly enough from the borders to the local units where the farmers reside. So especially if the farmers reside in very remote areas of the country because of transport costs, cost of distribution, and any other obstacles like domestic taxes and regulations, they may not really feel the effect of the increase in prices. And the third assumption, which is easy to satisfy in this case, is that the country is small enough, so it is a price taker in the world market. Now, just some key facts about Kyrgyzstan in terms of the trade and poverty profile. I believe that most of the audience is quite familiar with the region, so I don't really go into details. Just to briefly summarize, Kyrgyzstan is a very open economy. Its trade to GDP ratio has been very high, ranging from 73.7% to 146% during the past 20 years. It was the first among former Soviet Union countries to enter the WTO. It's also a major transit route for goods from China to other Central Asian countries and Russia. And in general, throughout history, Kyrgyzstan's trade has been characterized by trade deficit. Now, if we talk about the number of people or households which are affected by trade, we see that the number of people employed in trade and auto service in 2018 was 373,900, which is 15.7% of the working population. So it's really a lot. And if we put this number into perspective, this is the second industry that employs the most number of people after agriculture. Now, if we talk about the distribution of goods that are exported and imported, food products and live animals are usually in the top 3 categories of exports. And then we also have a lot of people, almost 500,000 people employed in agriculture, which makes it the first most important sector in terms of employment. So it means that in addition to those households who are affected by trade immediately because they are employed in the trade sector, trade also affects a lot of the people indirectly through the effect on agriculture. And then if we talk about, again, food products and live animals, Kyrgyzstan has been a net importer of this, which makes the families and the households very vulnerable to external price shocks. Now, just some key facts about poverty. So Kyrgyzstan is a lower middle income economy at the moment. Its GDP growth rates ranged from 3.8 to 4.7% in the past 5 years. However, due to COVID, negative growth is expected in 2020, and the situation is likely to get worse even further. If we talk about poverty headcount ratio at national poverty lines, it's quite high. It's 20.1% for 2019. And in general, poverty, the incidence of poverty is higher in the rural areas than in the urban areas. And then another way how we can look at poverty is through nutrition, or how many calories are consumed for the individual to be able to sustain the body. And if we use that parameter, then we find that almost half of the population is malnourished. So you can see that poverty is ubiquitous in the country. Now, why do I really focus on the production and consumption channels in my research? So as I mentioned before, here the farm household is the basic unit of analysis. And then when I discussed key facts about Kyrgyzstan, I said that agriculture is the crucial sector for the country's economy, and it is the leading sector in terms of the number of people it employs. Besides that, food products and live animals are among the leading categories, both for Kyrgyz exports and imports. And then we also have predictions. If we look at the predictions from theory, in particular, the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, it predicts that the low-skilled labor benefits the most from trade. And this makes agriculture especially important because in agriculture, we can be reasonably confident that very low-skilled people in rural areas can benefit from the production responses through trade. So because of these reasons, the impact of trade is the biggest for farm households. That is why I focus on production and consumption channels. Now, what is my specification? So here I use a standard Rajan-Zingales identification strategy. Basically, my dependent variable is consumption, total or individual consumption of both food and non-food items of the household H at time t. And then I construct a measure of the shock and interact it with a measure of natural trade openness, like inverse natural trade openness, which I call remoteness. And by doing that, I'm able to really study the effect, the production and consumption channels, and I will explain in a few slides a bit more about that. So my variables of interest are the shock variable, which is the world demand for the goods produced and sold by a household H at time T. And then my measure, my remoteness, as I said, is the inverse measure of trade openness of the household. Then I also include some variables of control, a standard set of variables of control. This is a fixed effects model. So I have household fixed effects, time fixed effects, and epsilon HT is the error term. Now, if I speak about the variables, so in terms of the dependent variable, I said it's the consumption of both food and non-food items of the household at time T in Kyrgyz soms per year. And here I look both at consumption at the family level, at the household level, and at the individual level. And here the important point is that consumption of food items from own production is excluded. And this is done on purpose because I believe that when I study production and consumption channels of the effect of trade on poverty, in response to the increased prices, the consumption capacity of the household should decline, right? This is the consumption channel. So we do not believe that the prices would directly affect how much the household consumes out of its own production. That's why I exclude that. And another reason why I exclude consumption of food items from own production is that if I include that, then I will have kind of this variable both in the left-hand side and on the right-hand side when I calculate the shock variable, because the shock variable will include the salt production and it will artificially drive the results in favor of the production channel. And I don't want to do that. Now, if I talk about variables of interest, as I said, one of them is a measure of shock, and it's depicted by the formula here. So here, alpha is the share of agricultural product P in the household H salt production. And there are two ways that I use alpha. There are two kind of alternative ways that I use alpha. In one option, I use it in terms of quantities sold, and in the other in terms of amount sold in US dollars, like how much households sold of its production. And in order to convert the quantities to amounts, I use the unit values for each commodity from the UN Comtrade database. And in order to do this analysis, I use 19 items for major crops and livestock that are available from Life in Kyrgyzstan data. Now, the second part is exports. But here, I actually look at the mirror statistics. So I don't really take exports from Kyrgyzstan, but rather I look at imports of product P in year T by countries of the world from Kyrgyzstan in US dollars per year from the UN Comtrade database. And the reason I do that is because I believe that mirror statistics provide a more reliable measure of exports rather than the export statistics of the country. Now, the second variable of interest is the remoteness variable. Which is the inverse measure of natural trade openness. So we expect that in general, trade affects households which are more integrated to trade more. And those households which are less integrated, which are less open, they might not feel the effect of trade so much. That is why I interact the measure of shock with remoteness. And for remoteness, again, I use different options, how to measure that. One is the travel distance in kilometers from population point where the household resides to oblast center by car. And in the second option, it's the travel distance from population point where the household resides to the cities of Bishkek or Osh, whichever is closer. And when I do calculate those, I use the geocodes comprising of longitude and latitude coordinates for the population point in the oblast center. And yeah, basically that's how I get these numbers. Now, for the variables of control, this is a standard set for the household characteristics. I also include time fixed effects just to control for macroeconomic shocks across years, and household fixed effects that that kind of take control of any time invariant household characteristics that may affect the outcome variable. Now, in terms of the predictions of the model, here I put a little table. So basically, what sign do we expect and for each of the channels that I discussed? So we expect the positive sign for the coefficient of shock if there is a dominance of the production channel, because it means that in response to increased foreign demand, the price of the goods is expected to rise, which will have a positive effect on the well-being of the household as measured by its consumption, right? But the negative sign would suggest the dominance of the consumption channel because it has a negative effect on the consumption capacity of the household. And when I talk about the interaction term, then I expect that it will be the opposite of the shock variable because it undermines the effects for more remote and thus less integrated households. Now, what identification assumptions are there? So one assumption is that variables of interest are exogenous. And I believe they are because this is foreign demand, very hard. So it's an exogenous variable. And another identification assumption is that as long as there are no time varying omitted variables, which are correlated with our variables of interest, but at the same time affect our dependent variable, our fixed effects estimation should provide unbiased and consistent results. And I try to control for that using additional household controls. Now, in terms of the results, so I have 4 sets of results. Basically, here is how the table should be read. So in the first 2 sets of results, I look at consumption per the household. So overall consumption of the household of both items. Then in the first table, in table 4 here, alpha is the share in terms of the quantities sold, because I said that there are different ways to use the alpha. And then I have also different sets of columns where in the first set of columns, I use remoteness 1 measure. And in the second column, I use the remoteness 2 measure. And the numbers I'm interested in are the shock variable and the shock and remoteness variables. And I see that in all cases, the shock variable is, the coefficient is positive and the interaction term is negative, which is evidence for the production channel of the household. And I see that the coefficients for the interaction term are statistically significant at 5 or 1% significance level. The shock variable is individual and not statistically significant. However, if I look at the joint significance of the 2 coefficients, then they are always jointly statistically significant. And in terms of the standard errors, I use robust cluster standard errors, but I also do the robustness checks using bootstrap standard errors and conventional standard errors, and I get even stronger results. And then maybe for the sake of time, I will just do the interpretation for 1 set. So because I'm talking about the interaction terms, I plug in some interesting values. So for example, if the households lives in the oblast center, then the increase in the foreign demand for goods by 12,143,660 US dollars, which is the 19th percentile of the shock, we expect an increase in the total consumption by 7,893 Kyrgyz soms per year, ceteris paribus. However, if the household lives in a very remote area, so it lives 196 kilometers away from the oblast center, which is the 19th percentile of distance, then the same increase in the foreign demand for goods will lead to actually a decrease in the total consumption by 27,809 Kyrgyz soms per year, ceteris paribus. So this, we see immediately that, first of all, the size of the shock matters, and second of all, remoteness matters. Now in the second...
Nurgul, sorry, we are running out of time.
Okay, so I will just say that the other results exhibit the same pattern when I use different alternative measures of the dependent and independent variables. And just to summarize, I get the result that we have a dominance of the production channel of the effect of trade on consumption, because the coefficient for shock is always positive and the coefficient for the interaction term is always negative, in spite of the different options that I use. And then, as I said, the magnitude of the shock matters, the integration of the household matters, etc. And basically, the policy implication would be that because we saw that those households that live very far away in remote areas, they're actually hurt by international trade. Economic policies should be devised to improve farmers' integration to agricultural markets so that they are able to really take advantage of trade and not to be hurt by trade. And that's it then from my side. And I welcome any questions or comments.
Thank you. I encourage participants to ask questions. It was very interesting. And I see there is, for now, there is no questions and answer, sorry. And maybe I'll just start with one. Have you in this work considered the issue of not external trade, but also internal? Because I guess people, especially in rural and more remote areas, they mostly, I mean, they sell their goods in bazaars, and they are part of those trade negotiations, transactions, but not external one, but internal one. Would it change your estimations and the links between trade and poverty in that case, and how it would be?
Thank you very much for the question, Altynai. So in this work, I do not really look at the internal trade. My objective was to look at the international trade and at the foreign demand. And one of the reasons was because I wanted to make the identification as clean as possible to have the exogenous independent variables. But of course, looking at the effect of internal trade on the well-being of households, on poverty of households would be really interesting. And I think if someone focuses on that area of research, that would give very, very interesting results. And I do agree with the comment that households who are engaged, maybe households who live in very remote areas, they're likely to engage more in internal trade rather than international trade. In terms of whether my results would change because of that or not, it's very hard to say, because the channels by which internal trade may affect the well-being of households and international trade's effect on households could be quite different. So it would be a very interesting research to do, but at this moment, I'm not able to give kind of more concrete predictions as to what happens if we look at that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if I may just ask one more question.
Please.
Just to speculate, for example, what if you meet today with a new minister on social protection or a new vice prime minister, what would you recommend in terms of decreasing poverty, especially after this COVID outbreak, how we should support our people in terms of trade within our integration in EU region? What would you suggest in terms of policy measures? What can be done?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. It's a very interesting, important, and a very difficult question. So if I speak in terms of the paper, in terms of the research that I just presented, some of the advice that I could give is trying to take measures to increase the integration of households, especially in rural areas, so they have more opportunities to be entrepreneurial. Because as I was presenting, I was saying that some of the households, especially the very poor ones, may not afford to be entrepreneurial. They want to be entrepreneurial, but they don't have the capacity to do that. And in order to do that, some concrete measures would be, for example, decreasing the costs of inputs, like getting the price of seeds, for example, like all the inputs that they use in the production, they should be accessible, they should be cheap, because sometimes they may be cheap, but there could be a shortage of that. So that would be the possibilities. And also trying to cut the different steps involved in trying to get your goods exported, like the steps required, minimize those, because with each additional step, we're adding a markup. And then maybe another, there are many things that could be done, but for example, some internal policies or domestic taxes or some things like that, they should be also minimized so as to make the goods competitive, and so that the farmers can really take advantage of that. And another, by the way, policy suggestion is because one of the reasons why very remote farmers are not able to really benefit from trade, according to this research, is the transportation costs. Or for example, if they live in very far away, they may have some impassable roads. So it's very hard to kind of bring the goods to the oblast center or to Bishkek and Osh so that it can be exported afterwards, for example. So road construction, all of this will help making the farmers more open and more integrated to trade.
Thank you. Thank you. It was very interesting. Looking forward for publication of this paper and looking forward for some other comments. And I see there are no other questions, so we can move to the second paper. Thank you. So the second presenter is Mr. Namazbai Ishmakhametov with a paper on analyzing the impact of macroeconomic shocks of 2014-15 on households' behavior. Namazbai Ishmakhametov is a former econometric modeling and data science expert with over 5 years of local and international experience. During his career, Namaz has worked as an expert at the National Bank of the Kyrgyz Republic. He also worked at the Deloitte Consulting in the New York City, where he served several clients from the top Fortune 100 list as a data science consultant. Namaz holds a specialist in mathematical methods and economic degree from the Kyrgyz Russian Slavic University. He holds Master of Science in Analytics degree from the Institute of Advanced Analytics at North Carolina State University. And Namaz is starting his PhD in machine learning at Kennesaw State University next fall. So please, I give a floor to Namaz.
Hi everybody. Happy to be here in these trying days. So let me just jump into presentation immediately, so we can save some time. Okay. So my countdown has begun. So my presentation is about the impact of economic shocks of 2014-2015 on the behavior of Kyrgyz households, and let's just proceed to a quick overview of all the crises and shocks that our country has experienced since its independence. So the first one was the default of Russian Federation. Second one was the global economic crisis of 2008. And the last one was economic shocks of 2014 and 2015. In this work, I define economic shocks as global energy crisis of 2014, when we remember when oil prices have just dropped from over 100 per barrel to below 60, and then they haven't climbed out of this pit by now. And a year later, we got currency crisis, the depreciation of Russian ruble in Russia. And given the close economic links that Kyrgyzstan has with Russian Federation, it was quite obvious that such a crisis would have some impact on Kyrgyz Republic. And most importantly, it would have impact on the behavior of households. And so let's just take a quick look at what was happening to our GDP during those crises. So we see that, so here I have line plot of GDPs of several countries, which are quite similar to Kyrgyz economy, which are MDA stands for Moldova, BLR stands for Belarus or Belarusia, and ARM stands for Armenia. We see that all 4 countries in this comparison plot, they experienced significant drop in GDP during all 3 crises. Okay, so here let's move to aggregate consumption, which here I define, which is one of the major components in GDP equation, as you know from macroeconomics. And aggregate consumption in my research, I'm concentrating on private consumption, which mostly consists of households' expenditures for final goods and services. And so basically here I'm looking at how this crisis has impacted private consumption of households. So let's take a look at change in total consumption. So I use the 1994 levels as 100% as base, based on which I make my comparisons, and we see that in our sample of countries, we also have significant drops of total consumption. So here is the period of our interest, and we see that Kyrgyz Republic also has experienced some drop in consumption. This drop was milder compared to our peers from this group, and the worst one was Belarusia. Okay, moving next. Another interesting part, I will get in more details about all the variables I'm using in next slides, but here I just want to draw attention that remittances from abroad, they are one of the most important channels of cash coming to Kyrgyz Republic, and in some years it was comparable to 30% of our GDP. So which makes it very interesting to see how remittances were changing and impacting households' behavior during the crisis periods. So here we see the same picture. Here my plot starts from 2005 when we started compiling the remittances data. And so we don't have the Russian crisis here. And we see that in both periods of world economic crisis of 2008 and shocks of 2014, 2015, Kyrgyz Republic has experienced significant drops in remittances flow. And this will be shown in the models. So here we see that I define my variables of interest, not variables. My questions of interest are household behavior, which consists of savings, investments, and consumption. And the expenditures are defined as the final consumption of households, and investments are investment in health and education, basically human capital, and investments in construction, because construction is, I would say, building own house is the sweetest dream of every Kyrgyz migrant. So the question I pose here is, how did the shocks of 2014, 2015, how they have affected the final consumption, savings, and investment in human capital and construction? Sorry for omitting construction. And as a data set, I was using KHS, Kyrgyz Integrated Household Survey, which is conducted by National Statistical Committee. And I will get into more details about the data set later. So let's move next. Okay, skipping this section. So based on literature review, we can split the main determinants of household consumption, of household behavior, into 2 groups: financial and economic, and socio-demographic. So as we can see here, it's quite obvious what financial economic factors mean, like income, debt load, macroeconomic situation in country, in region. By region, I'm saying the Central Asian region or Custom Union region, like big region of several countries. And social and demographic factors include both household-specific variables like family size, level of education, gender, age, structure of household, etc., and characteristics of local community. So basically, I mean, characteristics of community are also important because, for instance, if some small district has more access to some infrastructure, people from there might be able to earn more, to better communicate, to work, and so on. Okay, so moving next. Here are some main points from literature review. So we see that rural households are more vulnerable to economic shocks, and younger households are doing better during crisis because they can adjust their behavior. They can, I would say, based on my experience when I was doing masters, I was spending like below $200 per month, while American classmates were spending like $500-600, and I was just eating rice and chicken. I mean, younger people can adapt better to crisis, and they can save more, and they can kind of find a balance between living a worse life for several months or several years and getting out of crisis. What else? Gender. So households where head of household is female, they're more vulnerable to shocks. This might be due to the fact that in terms of Kyrgyzstan, if female is head of household, this might mean that she is widow or she has been divorced, and so the household doesn't have an extra earner. And quite obviously, the richer households, they are doing much better during crisis. Unemployment, if someone in household loses job, household loses additional income, and so they're doing worse during the crisis. And the availability of credit, debt load. I mean, I think everything here is quite obvious. Level of education, basically, the more educated households have better access to more opportunities to make money. Accumulated wealth. So with households with higher level of wealth is defined as house, land, cars, standard definition of wealth, and household size. Of course, the bigger your household is, the harder it is for you to adjust your expenses. So here's the data I have been using. So we have 6 waves of panel from 2013 to 2018, and after cleaning data and making sure that we have same households in each of the 6 years, I was left with 2,800 households, and they're guaranteed to have passed through all 6 waves of our panel. Okay, now let's just take a quick look at descriptives. We just see that our dataset, the KHS dataset, is more skewed towards males because in such a patriarchal country as Kyrgyzstan, of course, most heads of households are males. And we see that while we have almost even split between cities and villages, the KHS database, it has a bit of skew to the north of country, while most of people and most of migrants are from south. So this is something to take into account when interpreting results. Okay, I have 10 minutes left. Okay. So here we just see little comparison between total household spending, which I calculated based on my own panel. So the orange line is my calculations, and the blue line is National Statistical Committee's. And we see that my panel is quite representative because, except for year of 2016, everything else agrees between each other. So let's not waste a lot of time here. So we have comparison of quintiles, so groups of 20% of income and expenses in 2018. We see that this histogram is way narrower compared. The histogram of incomes is way narrower compared to histogram of expenses, which says that while households are forced to spend a lot, they have less room for maneuver when making income. So the range of income is quite limited. And we observe the similar pattern throughout all the years, and quite obvious during the crisis years, 2015 and 2014, we have pretty wide expenses because the range of expenses was changing quite broadly while income was still limited. So this is something to consider when making implications that households have limited opportunities for making income. while expenses are not limited by anything except for market speculations or shocks. So here we see another interesting plot, total expenses per province in 2014. So here we have provinces and we have the box plots of their expenses. And here we have the average expense per each region. And just a quick conclusion from these plots. I have plot for 2018 when crisis was over. Let's just make quick comparison. We see that in crisis years, for instance, Bishkek, Chuy, Talas, it was 71, almost 180. And 4 years after the crisis was over, we have 91, 123, 91, which signifies that after 4 years, households have increased their expenditures. And we observe similar pattern for all other regions. For instance, Narin, it spent average expenditure was 135 4 years after crisis, 3 years after crisis. And during the crisis, it was 124. So here conclusion is it takes households 3-4 years on average to jump back to pre-crisis expenditures. I didn't put 2013 data here just for sake of saving space. And now let's move to the model. So the basic model here is we have 6 equations for spendings because I have split spending into 6 categories: food and clothing, different services to population, communications, utilities, non-special expenses, everything that was left after making groups, long-term products such as furniture, jewelry, basically non-perishables, durables. And here we have the list of all our variables for our regressions and 2 equations for investments, human capital and construction. So the basic model based on literature review is dependent variable depends on crisis, X, vector of socioeconomic and financial variables, and Z is household unique time invariant variables like level of education, gender structure of household, and so on. And at the same time, we have the logit model where we are modeling the logit of variable save, which takes value 0 or 1, depending on whether household had savings during the crisis, during the year T, including the crisis years. And here we have same exogenous variables, socioeconomic ones and household unique ones. Here we have detailed specification, which I think I will not waste time right now, and you can take a closer look in the data glossary here. After the presentation will be shared with all participants. And okay, here is the data glossary. So basically, just a quick remark before jumping into interpreting the results of regressions. So we're gonna have 8 panel regressions, 6 for expenditures, 2 for investments, and the 9th regression will be logit 1 for savings. And when speaking about panel regressions, okay, I have 5 minutes, okay. When speaking about panel regressions, during the, given the endogeneity problem we have in our data set, we decided to use generalized GMM estimation using Hausman-Taylor approach instead of fixed or random effects, which would be not applicable. For instance, fixed effects is not applicable because we have time invariant variables, which would disappear after using fixed effects. And in Hausman-Taylor approach, we have to split our variables into exogenous and endogenous groups. So endogenous are those that are correlated with error, and exogenous ones that are set outside, uncorrelated with our errors. And here we see that, for instance, income fragile is whether household is fragile. Basically, if income per member of household is below the minimum wage in Kyrgyzstan. And all these variables are household specific. For instance, more educated households, they might have different levels of income. They might have lower probability of having migrant in family. So remit is whether it receives money from abroad, from Russia. and so on. So basically, this is a Hausman-Taylor split of variables. And next, we jump to our evaluation results. Here we have pretty horrible tables here. And so I'm going to skip them for now. And let's just jump into conclusions and interpretation of results. So basically, we have the main result is the shocks, they definitely have had an impact on behavior of households in terms of spending, savings, and investments, but this impact was spread unevenly across households. So households differing in several aspects like gender structure or income levels or anything else, they were responding in different patterns to this crisis. But the most common, the most general conclusion is that, for instance, savings, ability of households to make savings during the household years, it has decreased sharply. So, which is quite obvious. If you are under crisis and you have to manage your money wisely, you have no opportunity to save because you have to survive and you have to make sure your family is doing well, right? So another interesting conclusion is that southern households, they are saving more compared to northern households. And in this regard, there might be it might make sense to consider developing several policy instruments, for instance, line of deposit products or micro investment tools that are attractive to southern households because they are saving more and the government can make use of their money. Another conclusion is that high probability of saving during the period of depreciation of some indicates that population is just running into foreign currency or into other instruments, and this should be taken into account when taking policy measures. Another implication, okay, 90 seconds here. So the so-called female households with female as head, they are investing more in human capital, which makes sense because women might be worrying about the future of their children, and they want to make sure that children have better education, better health. And it would seem wise to develop several tools to support female households. For instance, facilitated microcredit insurance or easy credits for education, and so on. Households with higher education, they are more resilient to shocks. 50 seconds. They are more resilient to shocks. So it might make sense to develop some education credits with easy terms and let people get more education. And in terms of consumption, as we have shown in our box plots, it took 3-4 years for households to rebound, to jump back from low crisis levels to much higher pre-crisis levels of consumption. And this is something to take into account because, for instance, we have COVID crisis, and we might also expect that after 3 or 4 years, we might get our consumption back. And that's it for now. I'm ready for your questions. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Namazbai, for the nice presentation. It was clear and it was interesting. If participants have any questions, we are encouraging you to ask now. And I have one question, if I may start. As you mentioned rightly, we are now in the midst of the crisis that, I don't know, from Second World War, the world in general and global haven't seen, right? And do you find any similarities, what we could expect in terms of saving behavior and consumption behavior right after the COVID-19? Were people entering this time with more savings on their accounts? Were households richer in terms of savings this time in 2019, for example, before the crisis? And how it would change after, like in 1 year, in 2 years, what we would expect? And the same question as I asked previously, what would you recommend, like in terms of the same poverty, in terms of supporting those vulnerable households? Because in terms of female, I heard there is a nice program ran in India, for example, that government just in certain areas, they just distributed money to female households because they knew that they will be used properly for education, for healthcare, for buying certain goods that is kind of human investment in a human capital in terms of the region. So in that sense, what would you recommend in our case?
Okay. Thanks for question. And I see here that we basically have 3 questions here. Okay, let me start from the first
Okay,
one.
I don't see, I'm sorry, I don't see questions in here. Okay, okay, I'm sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I mean, I wouldn't call it, okay, if it's not questions, let's just call it points of interest, points of discussion. So how a country is going to get out of COVID-19 crisis this time, what will happen to us in the several years from now, right? And what about distributing money to female households given Indian experience, and basically what would be the broad measures of policymakers to help people? Okay, so let me start from the first one, finding some similarities between this crisis and between the coronavirus crisis and with the Russian crisis of 2014-2015, Russian energy crisis. So I would say, of course, we can expect similar results, but given the nature of COVID-19 crisis, which has a scale never seen before and which has impacted not regions, not just European Union or Americas or Custom Union, but the entire world, I would say that this crisis will be deeper, and I wouldn't expect our households would recover in just 3-4 years. It will most probably take longer because even those, even our partners who used to be helping us in past years, now they need help for themselves, right? So basically our opportunities for getting external aid will be much limited this time. And I would say we should be pretty careful making similarity based on my research and generalizing it to the COVID-19. I guess this time it will be deeper and it will take longer, maybe 5 or 6 years. And how COVID-19 crisis has impacted the households, I would say that even in pretty stable years, our households, they were not saving much, and most of people who are living around the poverty line or below it, most of their expenditures are for immediate consumption of foods, right? And given the nature of coronavirus crisis, I would say that opportunities for our households to save, they should have been depleted by now, because most of people, they were not able to save and they were even going into debt this time. I haven't seen the freshest statistical data on that, but I'm pretty sure that in 1 year we will see that most of households, they haven't saved anything, and they might have even went into deep debt this time. And what can government do to mitigate the effects? I would say, of course, assuming that we get back into legal, we get elections, blah, 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 we get the working government, I would say we have to somehow make the economy work, because unlike richer economies, we don't have luxury to choose to live in the state of constant lockdown. If people are not earning money, if people are not spending on them, we get into this vicious spiral of worsening crisis. So I would say the government and policymakers, they must do their best to help people go through crisis. I mean, increasing the healthcare opportunities to treat the sick people, finding money to support the vulnerable ones, and making sure that they don't jump from poor to the poorest category, and then somehow resuscitate the economy, make it work again. I would say this is the most important thing we have to do in the following year. And speaking about distributing money to female households, I find this Indian experience very fascinating and encouraging, and I would definitely support this, because based on my observations from this data set, so we can see that female households, they are kind of how to say, they're doing their best to ensure stable future for household. So unlike going into some risky adventures like trying to make some business or entrepreneurship, females, they might prefer to make sure that children, they get education and they will get job. So I would definitely support distributing money, or I don't know, giving some loans to female households. We just have to make sure that they will spend this money as declared, that they will not give it away to their relatives or spend for ceremonial purposes. Other than that, I support this idea.
Thank you. There are two questions here from Isabella Nauwek, if I pronounce correctly, from OECD. First question is, to what extent are your findings influenced by access to financial education, financial literacy, and banking or microfinance institutions?
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is, one clarification, savings here are deposits, formal finance services, or can also be household just saving money under the mattress?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let me start with the second one, which is easiest. So savings are everything. So the KHS database, they had a question, have you saved anything this year? And they had over 12 or 15 categories like bond, stocks, income, fixed income securities, just deposit, cash, and so on. So I just summed them up and I calculated the total savings. The reason I did this is because a lot of households, they have omitted this question. And if I was getting a more granular, if I was to get into more granular level of details like fixed income security savings, cash savings, deposit savings, I would just end up having almost no data, having just 2 or 3 sub panels with like 20, 30 observations in it. So that's why I went on to calculating the total savings. And if I have better data, I will definitely redo this model and make it more specific in terms of savings categories. And getting back to Isabella's question, so to what extent results have been impacted by education and financial literacy in particular, I would say that unfortunately the KHS database, they don't have, unlike Life in Kyrgyzstan database, they don't have questions about financial literacy. So basically I was using the total level of education, which was just a category ranging from high school education, bachelor, master's, and so on. I mean the regular split as we see in other research. So I don't have granular types of education, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the nice presentation. And as long as there is no other questions, we can move to the third presentation. The third paper discusses the issue of the issue of inequality, informality, and resource boom, the preliminary evidence from Kazakhstan. And it's prepared by Peter Howie and Zauresh Atakhanova from Nazarbayev University. Presently, Mr. Howie is a member of Graduate School of Public Policy in Nazarbayev University in Nur-Sultan, Kazakhstan. His research focuses on natural resource economics, policy and management, energy policy, development economics, and regulatory issues in resource-dependent economies. Recent works focus on climate mitigation policies and the relationship between inequality and informality in resource-dependent economies, nuclear power development, and structural change in resource-dependent economies. All of these research projects use Kazakhstan as a case of study. In addition to this research, Peter has recently joined a multi-year research project managed by academics from the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, that is examining the career mobility in Kazakhstan's extractive industries. if we move to the presentation, give a floor to Mr. Howie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Altynai. I will share my screen. So this presentation is on inequality, informality, and resource booms, and it's just preliminary evidence and findings, as this research isn't completed yet, as you'll find out later in the presentation. So what is the motivation for this research? Well, there are a limited number of papers that specifically look at the impact of resource abundance and inequality. And two, within this field of research, we are interested in the transmission channels by which resource booms cause changes in inequality. And the empirical literature on this topic is extremely thin. So our objectives are to study the effects of resource abundance on human development by examining the following hypothesis. Resource booms decrease the inequality of income and consumption by increasing demand for formal sector goods and employment within resource-dependent low and middle income countries. We are interested in assessing two things. We are interested in assessing the effects of market on the dynamics of informal employment and, in turn, inequality during resource booms. Why is this important? First, it's to provide governments evidence that the outcomes of policies focusing on formalizing workforce during a resource boom might suffer from spurious correlation. So just to show you some data about the how dependent Kazakhstan is on oil, what you'll notice is on this second column, real GDP, change in real GDP, and the last column, the oil price, Europe Brent. You can see that with 2015, 2016, oil prices were very low, at average $52 and $43. And you'll see that the change in real GDP during these 2 years was 1.2 and 1.1. While in 2011, the real GDP change was 7.5 when the oil price was 111. So there's a highly positive correlation between Kazakhstan's GDP and the oil price. So just looking at the dynamics of income and consumption values in Kazakhstan from 2001 to 2016, using 2008 tenge as my base value, what you'll notice is that from 2001 until 2013, sort of household non-durable expenditures, which is the red line, or C, the consumption of homegrown food plus household non-durable expenditures, which is the green line, the green dash line, and household disposable income all increased. But after 2013, you see that all three of them decreased. Okay? So there's been a change in the dynamics of median income and median consumption values in Kazakhstan. And these data are from the Kazakhstan Household Budget Survey that I've generated. Now, just looking at the Gini coefficient, again, for consumption of non-durable goods, consumption of non-durable goods plus homegrown production and income, just ignore the values from 2005 to 2008 for a moment. But what you'll notice is that inequality has decreased in general from 2001 to 2015, but actually inequality increased in 2015 and 2016. The increase with respect to disposable income and all three. So just coming back to what was going on in 2005 to 2008, that was a credit bubble in Kazakhstan, and you'll see this more, it's more prominent when I go further into other inequality values. So this is inequality in household consumption, the 50-10 percentile. So it's the median divided by the 10th percentile, the ratio. And again, what you'll notice here is that inequality dropped from 2001 to 2014 and then increased thereafter, but not considerably. And this is the 90th, 50th percentile. And here, again, what you'll see is that inequality, except for the credit bubble issue, in general decreased from 2001 to 2014 and has increased since. What was going on in 2005 to 2008 is that households could access very cheap credit. Credit was, loans were being offered at bus stops in Almaty when I used to live in Almaty at that time, and you could get loans very, very easily at in that period because there was a lot of foreign monies coming into the banking sector in Kazakhstan. And as a result, especially the middle class and upper class were accessing loaned money. So that's inequality side of the discussion. What about the informal workforce? Well, we look at it from 2004 to 2015. The reason why we look at it from starting in 2004 is just because of the definition of informal workforce has changed in the Kazakh labor force survey, and it's been fairly consistent from 2004. I didn't include 2016 because there's some issues with the 2016 data that I'm trying to deal with at the moment. So informal workforce, to focus on working age adults, we include individuals between the ages of 16 and 58 for women and 16 and 63 for men. Due to data availability over the study period, we restrict our analysis to employment in the respondents' primary employment. Many people in Kazakhstan have more than one employment position, but we're restricting it to looking at informality in the primary employment. Informality in the case of wage employment is indicated by a lack of an employment contract. This is just one definition of informality. We use this definition because it's fairly consistent in the data. A worker is considered self-employed if she or he is an employer, own account worker, unpaid family member, or member of a producer's cooperative. And self-employment is considered informal if the enterprise is not registered with the government. So here is just some data looking at the dynamics of informality in Kazakhstan from 2004 to 2015. What you'll notice is that according to our definition, which is very restrictive, informally employed in 2004 was 27.7. It dropped to 14.1 in 2013 and increased thereafter. What we've done with the informally employed is we separated these two, this informally employed into agriculture and non-agriculture. So the agriculture plus non-agriculture is 100%. We are not that interested in the agricultural informally employed. We're more interested in the non-agricultural informally employed. So we further separate the non-agricultural informally employed into wage workers and self-employed. And what you'll notice is that the predominant amount of informally employed are wage workers in Kazakhstan, over 90%. So what we do is we develop a theoretical model, and we follow Banerjee and Jain, and we consider an economy composed of consumers with identical preferences that differ in their levels of income. And these income differences imply differences in willingness to pay for quality. Individuals derive utility both from a composite commodity, X, which we consider an agricultural good, and an urban produced differentiated good, Z, which we consider provided by both the urban formal and urban informal sector. And individual's utility function is determined based on both consumption of the agricultural good as well as the differentiated good. The sub-utility for good Z takes the Dixit-Stiglitz form, where the consumption of a variety it's kind of over a probability uniform probability distribution. Each individual is assumed to supply inelastically 1 unit of labor, and individuals are either low skilled or high skilled, and low skilled plus high skilled is total labor, which is N. Individuals receive income from wages and their share of resource income, which is more or less a government support. Non-wage income is M and is equal to a return on the per unit resource rent. Therefore, the budget constraint of an individual is equal to their wage income plus the government support from the resource rent. We follow Banerjee and Jain and assume that low-skilled labor earns less in informal sector than the formal sector. This arises because of binding minimum wages and payroll taxes, which are easily evaded by informal firms. Furthermore, low-skilled informal workers receive a premium with regards to low-skilled agricultural workers, which is shown in the literature. And what we also assume is there's no differences in wages for high-skilled workers in the urban formal sector and urban informal sector, and this is shown by other research by Lehman and Jai. I can't pronounce that person's name. Furthermore, we follow Chow and Takayama and use a 4-sector model: agricultural, formal services, informal services, natural resource model, with high and low skilled labor as the only factors of production. We assume the agricultural good is produced by unskilled labor alone, with constant returns to skilled technology. We assume that the differentiated good industry, this is the formal and informal urban goods, consists of a set amount of profit maximizing firm operating in a monopolistic market structure, similar to Helpman, and the natural resource is only sold internationally. That is, there's no domestic market for the natural resource, and it can be produced without any inputs. And this is similar to many researchers, and they just assume that the resource sector is an endogenous gift because there's so few workers in this sector. Furthermore, our specification enables changes in inequality due to macroeconomic shocks. The effects of resource boom, which may be associated with increases in the amount of money provided by the government and income, skews the distribution of consumers towards purchasing more formal goods. Okay, this also moves some consumers from informal sector to the formal sector as workers as well, and also during the boom, production will shift from informal sector to formal sector due to increased demand for formal goods, and some consumers' income may also increase. So there's a kind of a secondary effect. Third, low-skilled workers will migrate from agriculture to informal formal sector, as well as low-skilled workers will migrate from the informal sector to the formal sector due to higher wages. And finally, higher skilled workers will migrate from the informal sector to the formal sector just because of more security in their jobs. Furthermore, the migration of both skilled and unskilled labor is bidirectional between the informal and formal urban sectors. However, we assume no return migration for low-skilled labor originating in the agriculture sector. That means that if an agricultural worker during the boom moved to an urban informal sector or urban formal sector, they don't return back to the agricultural sector during the recession. And this is similar to work done in Africa. As a result of labor migration, inequality will decrease during the boom. And also changes in inequality will be asymmetric because of the non-migration to the agricultural sector of low-skilled labor during a recession. So what we plan to do, and I'm running a bit out of time here, we have still not run the regression, but I'm showing you here the specification of the regressions. The first regression has inequality as a dependent variable, and we're regressing that on lagged inequality, lagged difference in inequality, and other variables. And these other variables include size of the non-agricultural informal sector, mean education level as a measure of the average educational attainment and can proxy the size of the middle class, gross regional product in logs as a proxy for overall development, share of gross regional product in mining and oil and gas to control the type of economic activity in each oblast, the average oil price in the current quarter, and lagged inequality. And the difference vector includes lagged inequality and per capita health expenditures as a proxy of the changes in institutional quality. And we plan to use the Orleano and Bond systems GMM to estimate this equation. Furthermore, we are planning to run a second regression, which regresses informality on lagged informality and a series of other regressors. Informality is the share of non-agricultural informal firms in region I in period T. Just to continue on, I'll jump that. Sorry. The vector of regressors on the right-hand side include lagged informal sector size, mean education level as a measure of the average educational attainment, GRP per capita as a proxy of overall development, share of GRP in mining and oil to control the type of economic activity, share of GRP in services, and also average oil price in the current quarter. And last, an interaction term of average oil price and a dummy variable that takes a unit value for an increase in the oil price between period T and T-1. What we're looking at here is we believe that there's, as I said before, there's an asymmetric effect of inequality in oil prices, and we just want to test that using the last term. And again, we plan to use the Orleano and Bond systems GMM to estimate our equation. So as I said before, there's still quite a bit of work to be done with this research. First of all, we have to solve the theoretical model. I've sort of developed the theoretical model, but I need to still solve some of the parts of it. And second of all, the data, the household budget survey data that I've done, analyzed so far is at an annual level, but I want to run the regressions on a quarterly level. So we have to separate all the data into quarters. And likewise for the labor force, I have to separate all the data into quarters by oblast. And then finally, we need to run both of the regressions. And as a result, we don't have any regression results at this time. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'll stop sharing, and I'll take any questions that are provided.
Thank you for sharing the theoretical part of the paper. We wish you all the success with this fascinating work. I can imagine how hard it is to work with the data, especially on labor and informal economy, because in case of Kyrgyz Republic, we don't have really good data on employment, unemployment, on labor, and it's I wish you all the success in that field.
Okay,
And
thank you.
I don't see any questions. Maybe, yeah. It looks like, yeah, no questions for now. And I have just one, maybe just if you can share with us with what is the Kazakhstan household budget survey data. We don't have it now.
Okay,
like we don't have something comparable.
Okay, this data has been collected from 2001 every year. It's for most years, it's collected on quarterly from 12,000 households per quarter. And it's panel for each quarter. And there's no pickup. If there's attrition, there's no pickup. Between years, there is a 20% carryover, but the problem is that they don't indicate which households have been carried over from one year to the next. So we just got to assume that we have to create pseudo panels. We can't use, there's no such thing as longitudinal data. What we do is we actually create pseudo panels. And what you have to do is you have to do it with respect to urban sector of an oblast and the rural sector of an oblast, and it's cluster sampling. So in general, it's the data obviously is fairly decent. The IMF and the World Bank have done some research looking at the quality of this data, and they say it's quite reasonable. It doesn't include the income data. Is a little bit problematic, but they say the consumption data is quite good. And
so it's not like a census. It's
like a census. It covers a lot. It's very there's a lot of information in it, and you just have to generate everything. The labor force survey is probably similar to in Kyrgyzstan. It's the only problem in Kazakhstan with the labor force survey is they change the definition of the variables once every 2 or 3 years. So you just have to make sure that when you're using variables, you're using the ones that have consistent definitions.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, there is no questions for now. Yeah, there is one question from Namazbai. Namazbai, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, for interesting presentation. And I just got a really quick question. So in your presentation, you considered some natural goods which are only sold internationally and require no inputs to produce, if I remember correctly. So
yeah, what I'm doing is I'm assuming like when I calculate the value for the home produced goods, I'm actually incorporating a shadow price for the inputs. So it's not just it's not it's not an equivalent revenue. There's actually a cost factor that is actually included.
Got it. Thanks for the clarification. And I'm just interested if it is possible to kind of tweak the model to account for exhaustion or replenishment of resources. For instance, if we take into account water, I mean, Kyrgyz Republic, it sells water to Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, but if we have drought year and our water wells are exhausted, it might take us, for instance, several years to replenish the water resources back to normal levels. And I mean, I understand that this model is only the beginning, but in future, do you think of kind of adding some factors to influence to account for replenishment and exhaustion?
I'm sorry, Namazbai, I don't know the water markets well enough in Kazakhstan. I don't know like how it works. So as a consequence, I'm a little worried about the costs and how, like, I must admit, I've never looked at the cost from the farm of water as an expense, and I have never looked at that value. And I'll be quite honest with you with that. It may be there, but I just haven't looked at it.
Got it. Just for instance, in case of Kazakhstan, oil also requires no inputs. I mean, like, of course, we have to extract this oil.
Yeah.
But then Kazakhs, they don't for instance, if they don't process this oil and then just sell it in the raw form, just raw oil, I mean, maybe in the future, it might be interesting to see how the exhaustion of oil wealth might be influencing the model, because, for instance, if you kind of try to calculate all the revenues or discount them from the future and maybe adding some exhaustion of Kashagan or other oil wells in 5 years or 10 years, it might be. Okay, yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. I'm kind of assuming that the government is doing is they're saving during booms and paying off during busts, but the evidence shows that they're actually doing the opposite.
Got it. Thank you very much. Thank
No problems.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we are almost right on time. There's no other questions. And thank you for the discussions. It was interesting and fruitful. And I wish you, all of the participants and your families, stay safe and healthy. It looks like hard time is coming and winter is coming. And thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Altynai.